Imani, dressed in an elegant evening gown, was driving home after a successful charity event. The event had gone off without a hitch, another night dedicated to a cause she believed in. But now all she wanted was to get home. Her phone vibrated on the seat next to her. It was her husband, David Reynolds, the newly appointed chief of police. He had been worried about Imani and wanted to pick her up after the event, but she had insisted on driving herself. Imani smiled slightly, recalling their brief conversation before she left. "David, I'll be fine. It's just the drive home, nothing special." He had reluctantly agreed but couldn't shake his unease. Now, sitting in his office, David stared at his phone, wondering why she hadn't answered yet. Maybe she's tired, but what if something happened? Why did I let her go alone? The road's deserted and it's late. I know how quickly things can go wrong. Damn, I should have picked her up like I wanted. He sighed heavily, gripping his phone. Maybe I should call again? Or, no, she'll say I'm worrying too much. But what if it's not just my paranoia? David dialed her number again, his voice tinged with even more concern. Imani didn't answer. Then red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror, causing her heart to race. It was a police patrol. Imani frowned, feeling a chill run down her spine. Why? She wasn't speeding, didn't run a red light, hadn't even touched her phone, and everything was fine. But she took a deep breath and did what she had always been taught. Comply, stay calm, don't make trouble. She pulled over to the side of the road and slowly came to a stop. Her heart pounded harder. She rolled down the window as one of the officers approached her car, tall, with a rigid posture and cold eyes. "License and registration." His tone was dry, devoid of any hint of politeness. Imani felt a surge of anxiety but didn't show it. She acted precisely, controlling her breathing, and handed over the documents without hesitation. "Good evening. May I ask why I've been stopped?" she asked calmly. The officer glanced at her driver's license, then looked back at her with a cold, expressionless gaze. "We received a report. A vehicle matching this description was seen engaging in suspicious activity." For a second, everything froze for Imani. Suspicious activity. What kind of reason was that for stopping her? She was alone in the car, coming from a charity event. How was this possible? Her stomach tightened. Something wasn't right. This night, which should have ended quietly, was about to turn into a nightmare. She hated conflicts. "Suspicious activity," she repeated, keeping her voice steady despite the growing anxiety inside. "Step out of the car, ma'am." The officer completely ignored her question. His voice grew sharper, his stance more rigid. Imani hesitated. "I'm sorry, I don't quite understand. Step out of the car. Now, I won't ask again." It was no longer a request but a harsh command, leaving no room for discussion. Before she could grasp what was happening, another patrol car pulled up behind hers. Two more officers got out. Their flashlights cut through the night. Imani felt her heart beat faster. This was wrong. Her hand trembled slightly as she unbuckled her seatbelt. She slowly opened the door, making sure her hands were visible, just as David had taught her. "I understand," she said in an even voice, full of tension. "But I would like to know why I'm being treated this way, and what exactly is going on here." Her calm tone seemed to only anger the officers more. One of the officers, tall and rough around the edges, approached the car with a look that suggested he already knew he would find something suspicious. There was no respect in his eyes, just a cold, piercing stare full of disdain. He walked past Imani as if she were invisible and yanked the car door open. "Let's see what you're hiding," he muttered with a smirk, ignoring Imani's indignation. He opened the glove compartment with sharp motion, as if expecting to find a weapon. Papers and documents were pulled out and rudely tossed onto the passenger seat. He didn't bother to be careful. Important papers were crumpled. Some fell to the floor. "What do we have here?" "A couple of papers to cover up." He snorted, not hiding his mockery. Another officer, younger but with the same stern expression, peered into the back seat. He rummaged through Imani's bags, pulling out items one by one and throwing them onto the seat with no hint of respect. "I wonder what rich ladies carry with them. Maybe a couple of illegal surprises," he said with a grin, sifting through her personal belongings. Imani stepped forward, holding back her anger. "You have no right to touch my things without a warrant." The senior officer standing nearby snorted, turning to her. "Oh, really? I thought we'd play it politely here. If there's nothing to hide, there's nothing to fear." He walked over to the trunk and slapped the tire with his hand. "Open the trunk." Imani tried to maintain her composure. "I am not required to do that without a proper order." The officer smirked irritably and, without waiting for her consent, shoved her aside and pulled the handle himself, opening the trunk. Inside were neatly arranged boxes with brochures from the charity event. "What's this? Contraband for elite ladies?" he commented sarcastically, tearing one of the boxes open and scattering the contents. He picked up one of the brochures, looked at it with disdain, and threw it back into the trunk like trash. "Oh yes, very suspicious activity. Charity leaflets, weapons of mass destruction," the younger officer added mockingly. Imani clenched her fists, feeling the anger rise in her chest, not because she had something to hide, but because their contemptuous, degrading attitude made her feel like a criminal in their eyes. But Imani was not a woman who bowed to injustice. "I want to call my husband," she said, cutting through the tension in the air. One of the officers smirked. "You can do that when we're done here." Her jaw tensed. She didn't want to make the situation worse, but her patience was running out. She stood firm, looking the officer straight in the eye, silently praying for this to end before it got any worse. But she had no idea that the situation was about to spiral out of control. The cold night wind touched Imani's hands as she watched the officers turn her car into a crime scene. The trunk was neatly organized with boxes of brochures and materials from the charity event. But the officers weren't interested in that. They turned over every paper, every item, as if expecting to find something illegal. One of the officers picked up a handful of brochures and squinted. "What's this?" he asked suspiciously. Imani met his gaze, not looking away. "I just came back from a charity event. These are brochures for the support center we're helping to fund." The officer looked at her for another second with an indifferent expression, then without saying a word, contemptuously threw the papers back into the trunk. The other officer, younger and noticeably nervous, stepped closer. "Are you saying there's no weapons, drugs, or anything illegal in your car?" he asked, smirking. Imani crossed her arms over her chest. "No, of course not. Do I look like a criminal?" Her patience was wearing thin. "I've already told you I haven't done anything wrong. I want to know why you're treating me this way." But her firm tone only angered the officers further. The senior sergeant stepped closer and slammed the trunk shut. "We're just doing our job. Don't get in our way." Imani's heart raced. She knew this wasn't standard procedure. This was humiliation. But what was about to happen next would change everything. Imani glanced at her phone, still vibrating on the passenger seat. Another call from David. She took a deep breath. "May I take my phone to call my husband?" Imani asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though her chest tightened with tension. The officers exchanged quick glances. One of them smirked, as if her request was amusing. He stepped forward, arms crossed over his chest, lips curling in contempt. "Oh, sure, call him. Let's see how fast your heroic husband can save you," he said mockingly. "Maybe he's at home watching TV and drinking tea. Or maybe he's just as important as you think you are." The other officer chuckled, nodding in agreement. "Yeah, let him tell us how innocent you are. Maybe it'll change something." Imani felt anger rising within her but held back. She knew any emotion would be used against her. "No sudden movements," the senior officer added coldly, though he had lost some of his initial confidence. Imani slowly reached for her phone, moving precisely and carefully, giving them no excuse for aggression. Inside, she seethed with anger, but outwardly, she remained unshakable. "Let's see how you react when you find out who my husband is," she thought, dialing the number. Imani resisted the urge to roll her eyes. The officers almost seemed disappointed, but she gave them no reason for aggressive actions. But it wasn't over yet. "We're checking your plates and driver's license," one of the officers said, stepping aside. Imani crossed her arms and watched silently as the headlights of the second patrol car lit up her vehicle, as if it were a crime scene. Suspicion, prejudice, complete disregard for her dignity. It was outrageous. But she knew that the slightest emotion could be perceived as resistance. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. With a steady hand, she dialed her husband's number. He answered almost immediately. Amani, are you okay? I've been trying to reach you. Why didn't you pick up? She didn't let him finish. David, I've been stopped by the police. They're searching my car without any reason. I need your help, urgently. On the other end of the line, her husband's voice changed instantly. Concerned. Authoritative. Where are you? Send me your location. I'm on my way. Amani ended the call and sent her location. She noticed the officers watching her closely, their nerves evident. They didn't know who she was talking to, but something about her confidence unsettled them. Their mockery gradually turned to hidden tension, as if they instinctively felt they had made a mistake. At that moment, David Reynolds was already speeding towards her. The powerful engine's roar filled the cabin of his black SUV, but in his mind, there was only one sound, the furious pounding of his own heart. How did I ever let her go alone? Why did I listen to her? Thoughts raced through his head like flashes of lightning. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Anger boiled in his veins. They dared to touch her? They dared to humiliate my Amani? He remembered her voice on the phone, tense, restrained, but he knew her too well not to hear the hidden fear behind her composure. And it was driving him mad. If they lay a finger on her, I swear I'll tear them to pieces. His jaw clenched, his gaze turning steely. He wasn't just speeding, he was flying through the night, driven by fury and love. Memories flashed through his mind, her smile over morning coffee, her laugh on their first date, the warm look in her eyes when she said, "Everything will be fine." But it wasn't fine now, and he'd do everything to make it right. His thoughts were clearer than ever. He wasn't just a husband, he was a man ready to protect his wife at any cost. Let them try to argue. Let them dare look at her the wrong way. I'll show them what real power is. The headlights of his SUV cut through the darkness like a knife. And at that moment, David's world narrowed to one goal, protecting Amani, and no one could stop him. Minutes dragged on painfully. Each second felt like an eternity. Amani stood motionless, despite the humiliation, patiently waiting for help. Passing cars slowed, drivers casting curious glances at the scene. And then, the sound of an approaching vehicle. A sleek, black SUV stopped with precision. The driver's door opened, and out stepped David Reynolds. Tall, confident, exuding authority. He was like a storm, barely contained by his outward calm. The road fell silent as he closed the car door. The officers looked at him, uncertainty and even fear flickering in their eyes. David was dressed in a sharp suit, and his police badge gleamed on his belt. The chief of police. He approached the officers. Each step was measured and deliberate. "Good evening," he said in a steady, sharp voice, cutting through the tense air like a blade. And what happened next, no one could have predicted. "I am David Reynolds, chief of police." His voice was calm, but there was steel in that calm. "Can anyone here explain to me why my wife is detained and her car is being searched without any reason?" The captain, who was clearly in charge, straightened up immediately, trying to hide his confusion. He was afraid even to look David in the eye. "Sir, we're conducting an investigation. We received a report of suspicious activity involving a vehicle matching this description." David's eyes narrowed. His jaw tensed. "Suspicious activity?" he repeated slowly, stepping forward. "A sedan driven by a woman in an evening gown returning from a charity event?" Tense silence hung in the air. "Do you realize you're talking about this woman?" The young officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the captain for support. The senior officer cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "We didn't know her identity. We were just following procedure." David took another step forward. "Procedure?" His voice grew harsher. "Since when does procedure include searching a vehicle without a warrant and without sufficient cause? Why is the car turned inside out? What were you looking for?" He swept his gaze over the officers. "Did she give you permission to search?" Silence. No one answered. "Thought so." Amani finally broke the silence, her voice firm but tinged with hurt. "They wouldn't even let me call you right away. They treated me like a criminal from the start." David turned to her, and for a moment his gaze softened. But when he looked back at the officers, his eyes burned with rage. Do you understand the level of accountability you're bringing upon the entire department right now? His voice grew quiet, making it even more threatening. You detained an innocent citizen, my wife, without any grounds. I should... David was at his limit, but he tried to keep control. The young officer swallowed hard, barely whispering, "We were just doing our job, sir. We apologize." Doing your job? David cut him off with a sharp motion of his hand. Your actions speak otherwise. He pointed to the growing crowd of onlookers, many of whom were already recording the incident on their phones. And these cameras ensure your work will be reviewed from all angles. The captain finally found the courage to speak. Chief, maybe we should discuss this at the station. We need to de-escalate the situation. David smirked, but there was no humor in it. De-escalate? How dare you speak to me like that? He shook his head. After you humiliated my wife and violated her rights? No. We'll handle this right here, in front of everyone. The silence became almost tangible. The crowd around them grew, people whispering, discussing what they were witnessing. Call your superior, now, Wisdom, David ordered. The captain hesitated, his face a mix of shame and anger. A nervous tremor pulsed through his temples, but under David's searing gaze, he had no choice. He averted his eyes, pressing his lips into a thin line, and slowly reached for the radio on his shoulder. His fingers trembled as he pressed the button. His voice, usually confident and composed, now revealed his tension. HQ, this is Captain Anderson. Immediate support required. Need Chief Harris. Urgent. He tried to mask his uncertainty with a formal tone, but the strain was still evident in his voice. His pride was crumbling, as if each word was a blow to his ego. The radio crackled in response. Repeat, Captain. What's the urgency? Anderson swallowed, casting a quick glance at David, who stood tall, the embodiment of cold fury. We have a complex situation at the detention site. Chief Harris is needed immediately. He deliberately left out David's name, trying to buy himself some time, though he knew it was pointless. His words sounded hollow, as if he were swallowing the remnants of his own authority. The radio crackled again. Understood. Harris is on his way. The captain slowly lowered the radio, avoiding eye contact with David. His face was tense, as if he were holding back not words, but desperation, realizing the consequences were unavoidable. David tilted his head slightly, his eyes cold and calm. But it was this restraint that was most frightening. Well then, David said, taking a step forward, we'll wait. The silence became deafening, like the calm before a storm about to break. Minutes of waiting felt like an eternity. David stood, unwavering, staring down the officers, with Imani beside him, her posture straight and head held high, despite the humiliation she had endured. Finally, a black SUV arrived. A man in a formal uniform, Captain James Anderson, stepped out. He approached the group, surveying the scene. What's going on here, Anderson? Why the urgency? He asked sternly. David stepped forward. Captain Anderson, your subordinates stopped my wife, searched her car without a warrant and without just cause. I'm waiting for an explanation. Anderson blinked, recognizing who stood before him, but not fully grasping the gravity of the situation. David, I didn't know that. My men will be held accountable. David cut him off. It doesn't matter who she is. Every citizen deserves respect and fair treatment. He pointed at the officers. This was anything but justice. What are you teaching your subordinates? Anderson turned to his subordinates, his face pale. Have you lost your minds? Searching a car without a warrant? The captain mumbled. We received a report of suspicious activity. Enough with the excuses, David interrupted harshly. You had no grounds whatsoever. He looked at Anderson. Do you understand what this will lead to? Your department is now under scrutiny, all because your subordinates decided to abuse their power. Anderson struggled to speak. I'll personally handle the investigation, Chief. David shook his head. It's not just an investigation, Captain. It's a matter of accountability. This cannot go unpunished. The crowd murmured in support. Phones were still recording, capturing every word. But the story didn't end there. The next morning, the video of Imani's detention spread across social media. Clips of the incident went viral, gathering thousands of views and comments. Hashtags like # Justice for Women and #accountability matter quickly topped the trends. News channels picked up the story, showing footage from the scene, and article headlines raised sharp questions about the conduct of the police department. Imani and David sat at breakfast. The soft morning sunlight filled the kitchen, but the atmosphere in the house remained heavy. Imani held her coffee cup tightly, her eyes full of fatigue but still shining with determination. David held his phone, scrolling through news articles, comments, and eyewitness accounts. "They're calling it the highway incident," David said quietly, frowning. His voice was tense. "I knew it would cause a stir, but I didn't think it would be this big." Imani set her cup down and looked at her husband. "This isn't about us, David," her voice was firm. "It's about how many people face this every day and don't have the platform to tell their story. They need justice too." David nodded, pressing his lips together. "I've fought against this kind of behavior my whole career." He paused, gripping his phone tightly. "And it's clear there's still so much work to do." Later that day, an emergency press conference was held. David stood at the podium with Imani and other police department leaders by his side. Before them was a sea of journalists, cameras, microphones, and members of the public. David took a deep breath and began. "What happened last night was unacceptable." The room fell into complete silence. Every word he spoke was filled with emotion. The actions of these officers didn't just break protocol. They betrayed the trust that society places in law enforcement. He scanned the room and added, "I want everyone to know this is not who we are. And this is not who we should be." He paused, letting the words sink in. "There will be a full and transparent investigation. The officers involved have been temporarily suspended from duty." The room buzzed with approval. David continued, "But this isn't just about punishment. It's about systemic change." He looked directly into the cameras. "We need to ask ourselves why these situations keep happening. And more importantly, what are we going to do about it?" Imani stepped up to the podium. She adjusted the microphone and looked at the crowd. Her posture was impeccable, but her voice carried the pain of her experience. "When I was stopped that night, I felt powerless," she began, pausing. "I did everything right, followed all the instructions, but it didn't matter." The room was heavy with silence. "They didn't see a person in me. They saw a problem to solve." Imani looked around the room, meeting the gazes of dozens of people. "I know I'm not the only one who has felt this way." She pressed her lips together, holding her breath for a moment. "But I also know that change is possible. It starts with accountability, with people who have the courage to speak up, and with leaders willing to fight the system from within." She turned her head toward David, then back to the room. "We must do better. For everyone." In the following days, real changes began to take place. The police department announced the introduction of new training programs aimed at reducing aggressive detentions and eliminating implicit biases in officers' work. A civilian advisory board was established to monitor police transparency and accountability, not just as a pretty declaration, but as a real tool. David didn't stop at words. He met with local community leaders, looked them in the eye, and promised real change. This time there was no room for excuses, no room for silence. In the evening, a few days after the incident, the atmosphere in a small office at the police department was heavy. Captain James Anderson stood by the window, staring at the dark sky outside. His face was tense, exhaustion reflected in his eyes. Behind him in the room sat the three officers involved in Imani's detention. They looked as if every word said at the press conference had been a blow to them. Anderson took a deep breath, then turned and walked to the table. "Do you understand what you have done?" His voice was low but had a steel note. "This isn't just a mistake. This is a national scandal. Our department is under a microscope." He slowly surveyed his subordinates. "What were you thinking? That no one would notice? That you could humiliate people just because you have a badge?" Captain Mark Taylor tried to justify himself. "We were just doing our job, Captain." "We received a report of a suspicious vehicle." Anderson slammed his fist on the table. "Don't give me that nonsense, Taylor." His voice echoed off the walls. "Your work is now everywhere, on video, in the news, on social media. Did you see this face?" He pointed to a newspaper lying on the table with a picture of Imani and David at the press conference. This is the face of the person you humiliated without reason. The room was filled with oppressive silence. Officer Brian Turner sat quietly, his hands clenched into fists. He looked downcast, his face pale. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice hollow. I, I didn't want it to turn out this way. Anderson looked at him with scorn. Didn't want it? You saw perfectly well how you were overstepping your authority. Why didn't you stop? Or was it easier to stay silent? Brian lowered his head. It seemed he was struggling with himself, trying to find the right words. I just thought we were doing the right thing. He sighed heavily, running his hands over his face. But now I realize I was wrong. This wasn't work. This was abuse. Anderson squinted. Too late for that, Turner. Now we all have to clean up this mess. Brian was silent for a moment, then raised his head. His voice grew firmer. I will resign. The room fell into a deathly silence. Taylor turned sharply to him. Are you crazy? Why do that? We were just... No, Captain. We weren't just doing our job. Brian stood up, his hands trembling, but his eyes burned with resolve. We humiliated an innocent person, and that can't be justified by orders. I don't want to wear a badge anymore if it becomes a symbol of fear and injustice. Anderson silently watched him, his face remaining impassive. Finally, he nodded. At least you had the courage to admit it. Brian took his things and headed for the door. At the threshold, he turned and added, if anyone still thinks we did the right thing, let them look that woman in the eyes again. He left, slamming the door behind him. Silence reigned again in the room. Anderson looked at Taylor and the other officer. Well, Captain, do you have anything to add? But Taylor remained silent, avoiding his gaze. For many, this case became a turning point, evidence of how unjust the system can be, but also a reminder that it can be changed. Imani didn't stay on the sidelines. Her story resonated in the hearts of thousands. She spoke of her experience not with anger, but with something even more powerful, with hope. This isn't just about what happened to me, she said, looking into the cameras. It's about what we will do to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. And only one question remained in the air. What will you do? Well, thank you for listening to the story till the end. Don't forget to leave your feedback on this story. Subscribe to the channel, let me know, and share this video with your friends and loved ones. This motivates us to continue working on new stories every day. Don't miss the next amazing story that's about to appear on your screen. We are very grateful to have you with us. See you next time.